Hey everyone, it's been 1 year since I started learning Japanese, so it's time for me to post another progress video. The past 3 months have probably been the most productive time for me so far, but before I talk about that, I'll quickly recap what I did for the first 9 months in case you haven't seen any of my other videos. So the reason I wanted to learn Japanese was at the start of 2023, I booked a trip to Japan later in the year, and I kind of wanted to be a bit more familiar with the language. The first month was a bit of a mess, and I wasn't really sure how to get started or what I should be focusing on. After some Googling, I did end up learning hiragana and katakana, as well as briefly using Genki. I then discovered input learning methods like AJATT, refold, etc. But the biggest push in the right direction for me was TheMoeWay. They have a really detailed guide on how to get started, as well as a resource list for immersing with native content as soon as possible. Also, any resources I talk about, I'll leave a link in the description in case you're interested. After that, I set up Anki with the Core 2K 6K deck and briefly read through Taikim's grammar guide to get kind of familiar with the basic grammar. Month 2, I started watching anime with Japanese subtitles. Once I'd reached around 1,000 words in Anki, I also started sentence mining at this time. For the third month, I continued to watch anime, but I also did try some manga. I found it a bit tedious at the time to do lookups, so I attempted a light novel instead. It was definitely too early at this time, but I pushed through it and finished reading my first light novel after 60 hours. I also started reading manga again afterwards, as I found a new method to do lookups, which made it a lot more enjoyable. Month 4 was mostly the same, just watching anime, reading manga, occasionally some YouTube videos, and a visual novel. At this point, I put my Japanese learning on hold so I could properly prepare for my trip, which was coming up soon. It was definitely a great experience, but the Japanese I'd learned wasn't really enough to benefit in any way. It wasn't until 6 months later, in early 2024, that I had a lot more free time than usual, and I started reading a manga in English. I felt like if I'm reading manga anyway, I may as well just be learning Japanese at the same time so I could at least get something from it. I was definitely still very naive at this point as to how long it would actually take to get good at Japanese, so I started up again and quickly got back into a routine. For the 5th and 6th month, I started Anki, sentence mining, and watching anime and reading manga again. Thankfully, a good amount of what I'd learnt before had stuck with me, so I only had to quickly go over the first 1,000 or so words in the Core 2.3K deck before I got straight back into immersion. I didn't really have any intention of taking it too seriously at the start. I just wanted to spend an hour or two a day reading manga and watching anime and slowly progressing from there. It wasn't until month 6 that my goals kind of changed and I started to put more effort into it. I caught up to where I was last year and quickly surpassed that level. At the end of month 9, I pretty quickly realised how much effort and time it takes to actually learn the language. I'd put in around 1,300 hours at that point, and I wasn't even really close to where I wanted to be, which was quite disheartening, but I think the change of mindset helped me continue and adjust my expectations to be slightly more realistic. And yeah, that's pretty much how the first 9 months went for me. There were definitely a lot of ups and downs, but I'm really glad that I started again, and I feel like I've recently hit the most enjoyable stage of learning. And now I'll quickly talk about how the past 3 months have been going, starting with probably the most boring part, Anki. I'll also have timestamps on the video if you want to just skip to any sections you're interested in. So I did say this was the most boring part, but I've actually had a lot of progress. I slightly changed my method for adding new cards. I used to only add a word if it was under 10,000 frequency, but now if it's 30,000 or less, or if I've seen the word in 2 or more books, then I'll add it. This made it much easier to sentence mine afterwards, so I decided to increase my daily cards from 15 to 25. I've been doing this for around 2 months now, and I honestly regret not doing it sooner. My Anki times did increase to around 40 to 50 minutes, but my vocab has definitely started to grow quite rapidly recently, so it feels worth it. I currently have just under 6,000 cards, which is slightly lower than I wanted it to be, and I definitely do still feel held back by my vocab, but overall I'm pretty happy with where I'm at. I have learned a lot more words from just immersing that I don't have cards for, so it's impossible to say how much I actually know, but it's probably around another 200 or 300 words, if not more. Another big change I had that's kind of related to Anki is that I finally put more effort into using the Monolingual dictionary. I had briefly mentioned in my last video that I started using the Japanese dictionary for lookups, but I wasn't really fully comfortable with it yet. I think I had the wrong idea in my head of how it worked. I thought that I'd 100% fully swap over and basically never use an English dictionary again. While I am definitely comfortable with using it and have it defaulted as my first definition that I see when doing lookups, I do still use the English dictionary a lot. But yep, that pretty much covers everything for Anki and the monolingual transition. So I'll talk about my reading next. So in terms of reading, in the past 3 months I've probably seen the most progress compared to before. It wasn't really anything that I did different, but at around the 11-month point, it was like something clicked for me. I'm not really sure why it happened, but my comprehension just seemed to massively improve at that point. Depending on what I'm reading, I can mostly follow along with everything, as well as some of the more nuanced details. Obviously, there are still times that I get lost, but it doesn't really last as long or happen as frequently compared to before. I've also been making more of an effort to read slightly harder books recently. I noticed myself staying in my comfort zone a bit too much with high school, romance, comedy, those kind of things, and I wanted to branch out a bit. So a couple of weeks ago I read Sayonara watashi tachi ni yasashika nakatta subete no hitobito. It was definitely the hardest book I've read so far, but also not as difficult as I was expecting. It was still based on high school characters, but most of the time it wasn't really set in high school. There were definitely a good amount of obscure religious, historical, and descriptive vocab, but I definitely think the hardest part for me was trying to fully understand what the writer was actually trying to say at times. But yeah, that pretty much covers everything for reading. Some of my favourite books were Sayonara watashi tachi ni yasashika nakatta subete no hitobito, I Want to Eat Your Pancreas, Too Many Losing Heroines, and Kohaku no Aki 0 no Tabi. And ending on a good point for reading, I'll go on to the bad points of my listening now. As usual, I neglected my listening, and it continues to be my weakest point. Honestly, I'm just so jaded when it comes to anime that I find it hard to enjoy anything right now. With that being said, I do actually still enjoy watching new anime or adaptations of a book I've read. Past month, I have pretty consistently been watching at least 1 hour of anime per day, but not really anything else apart from that. Over the past few months I did put in over 70 hours, which isn't too bad, but it's definitely not enough to see a good amount of progress within a short amount of time. Some of my favourite anime that I watched were Penguin Highway, Akunohana, Days with My Stepsister, I Want to Eat Your Pancreas, and I also watched Too Many Losing Heroines after reading the first 4 volumes of the books. And for the first time, I prefer the anime over the books. But yeah, I'll continue to do around 1 hour most days, but I won't really push for more right now. And I'll quickly talk about my current stats for the past year now. I'm feeling quite good about my current hours with where I'm at. Taking the break early on definitely set me back a bit, but not too much thankfully. For the past 3 months I've done 60 hours of Anki, 400 hours of reading, with 22 light novels read, and 69 hours of mostly anime but some YouTube as well. For the entire 12 months, including my times before I took a break, my total hours are 252 hours of Anki, 1,420 hours of reading, with 192 volumes of manga and 46 light novels read, and 279 hours of listening, which is around 1,950 hours in total. It averages out to be around 5 hours and 20 minutes of immersion per day. Honestly, it doesn't really feel too hard to keep going with these numbers, and if I do it for another 6 to 12 months, I'm sure I'll see a massive amount of improvement. And that pretty much sums up everything for my stats at the moment, so I'll talk about my current comprehension right now. So I'll start with my current reading comprehension, since that's mostly what I've been focused on. Honestly, it's kind of hard to say how much or how little I understand right now. I feel like I've definitely hit a stage where the amount of hours I put in really makes a difference compared to before. I think during the next 3 to 6 months, I'm probably going to see a huge amount of progress. In terms of comprehension of what I've been reading, if I had to give an estimate, I'd probably say it's around 80 or 90% in general. Obviously, it depends a lot on the genre and the difficulty of what I'm reading. For example, I probably wouldn't have an 80% comprehension if I started reading the news or a non-fiction novel. But for the area that I have been focused on, I would say there's even times that I can understand 95 to 99% of it. Of course, this doesn't mean I understand everything, but it is enough for me to thoroughly enjoy the story and really appreciate the smaller details. I would say vocab is still holding me back, but that will probably always be the case. It has gotten slightly easier while reading, as I can quite often now guess the meaning of a word just from the kanji used, even if I don't know the reading for it. So as for my listening, once again, it's quite hard to judge. If I'm using subtitles, watching slice of life anime, I can probably understand around 70%. Sometimes it's more, sometimes less, but generally I can just kind of start watching an anime and I don't have to pause to look at words to be able to follow along. Generally, I do watch easier anime since my level is still lower than my reading. So if I started watching something like Attack on Titan, realistically I'd probably be lost in the first 5 minutes. When it comes to watching YouTube or streams, once again, with subtitles, I can probably follow along with 60 or 70% as long as the topic isn't too far from what I'm used to. But as soon as I turn those subtitles off, my comprehension drops quite a bit. So my output is non-existent, so I can't really talk about it. I've written maybe 10 sentences in total, and they were definitely the level of a 2-year-old, but probably in another 6 to 12 months, I'll feel comfortable to start outputting. This was never really a huge goal of mine, so I'm fine delaying it as long as possible for me to build up a good amount of vocab and just overall knowledge of the language first. And yeah, that basically sums up the past year for me. I'll quickly talk about my future plans and then end off the video. So I do have some goals that I want to work towards in the next few months. Most of it is just reading certain series that I'm interested in, or arbitrary goals like 10,000 Anki cards. With my reading speed and comprehension increasing quite a bit recently, I do want to push to read more light novels, especially from genres that I haven't really tried yet. I would also really like to revisit Japan at some point. I think when that time comes, it will probably be a good motivation boost for my listening, so I can hopefully output whilst there, and obviously I need to be able to listen for that, so that's definitely something for me to think about, but that probably won't be for another year or so. And yeah, apart from that, I'll basically just be immersing like usual. I'm currently doing 40 to 50 minutes of Anki, 5 hours of reading, and 1 hour of anime per day, which is definitely more than enough for me to progress. So there's no real need for me to change it, especially if I'm happy with it. If you've made it this far, I feel a bit sorry for you having to listen to me rambling. And yeah, see you next time, and good luck everyone with your own Japanese progress.